So today we're here to talk about rebuilding in Dynasty Fantasy Football. And basically, the first thing we need to kind of discuss is if you need to rebuild, what's the keys to like seeing that, hey, my team needs to rebuild. Obviously, if you're not doing well in your league, probably time to rebuild. The way I look at it is I look at my max points for compared to the rest of the league. If I'm bottom 2 to 3, it's time to rebuild. If I'm even in the middle, and
Mm,
unless I have like players on the IR or I'm just having kind of an off year, like I did in a few leagues, there were a few leagues where I've been a top 10 competitor or a top 2 competitor for years. And just between injuries and COVID, I just had a really rough year where I'm like, I'm not going to just necessarily rebuild, even though I kind of want to. It's one of those things where, you just kind of got to be conscious of the situations around you. I know Chev, you've kind of touched on that as well. Staying out of the middle, like the worst thing you can possibly do
mhm.
is just be in the middle because you're not getting great draft picks. You're kind of you might be squeaking out a good 106 or a good 107. What are your keys to kind of knowing when you need to rebuild? Like I said, I've touched on a couple already, but what are some of your keys to knowing when you need to rebuild?
Yeah, and it can also be you might even get into your playoffs and win a playoff round, but you should know, like, okay, I'm getting a little bit lucky now with the people I have on my team. Like Sony Michelle just put up 30 points this game. I just had Devonta Freeman give me 18. Like, you need to also be real with yourself. You may have a playoff team, but you need to look at the other rosters and be like, okay, this guy is going to be pretty dominant for the next 2 years. I can't keep up with that. Let me see if I can get ahead of him in year three in this rebuild and then move forward. Because I think that's a huge thing. Like, if you don't look at the other rosters around you, then I think that could really hurt you in the long run. Because if you're a team that has those two players and you barely squeaked in, you're not going to keep that up. You need to realize, okay, I can rebuild and then be better in the next future. And that guy's going to fall out because he's trying to win championship right now. And I think that's a huge thing to just realize, where am I at in my league? Am I that close or am I kind of in the lower tier? And once you figure that out, once you're real with yourself, then you can move forward in the rebuilding process. Or maybe you're going to go for it. But I think you definitely have to take a really close look at your league mates as well.
Yeah, I think the worst thing you could probably do in Dynasty, or one of the worst things, there's a lot of things you can do poorly or wrong,
Hmm.
but it's kind of like just overestimate your team. But it's one of those things where you just have to be real, look at your team in the mirror and just kind of, gauge where you're at compared to like the other teams in the league, like you said.
Hmm.
And you could still absolutely get lucky or just have a really good playoff run. That is totally possible. And it's happened. There's plenty of teams, plenty of 101 seeds that have been kicked out by a 6 seed or lower,
Yeah.
however many teams you're letting into the playoffs. But there's plenty of cases where you can absolutely do that. But I think more often than not, you just kind of have to look at your roster as a whole and be like, is this a championship team? And try to do it objectively because there's plenty of names out there that, the big names that, Terry McLaurin is a prime example that comes to
Hmm.
mind for me that, huge name coming in. You would never expect a team that has Terry McLaurin level talent on it throughout the roster would struggle for an entire year, but that's just the reality of Terry McLaurin's situation and
Hmm.
situation of a lot of big name fantasy players. But with all that said, like I said, look in the mirror, evaluate the points for and the points against is a huge metric I look at. If you're middle of the row and points for and your points against is like nothing, you need to check yourself. With all of that said, we're going to dive into like the first steps you should take when you get into the rebuild. For me, number one thing is establish your core players, the players that are going to help you for 2+ years in the future. A lot of times it's going to be younger wide receivers.
Hmm.
Those are just because they tend to hold value the longest. And then the players you want to build around, that you want on your team. If you feel strongly about guys, don't just dish them for the sake of dishing them. I would say that there are some players that, you kind of want to get off your roster because the value is going to be at its peak right now, but you
Hmm.
don't necessarily want to just dump players that you like just to get value. I get that. That's my biggest thing. When it comes to running backs and everything like that, their lifespan's pretty short in the league. When they come in, they're kind of ready to go. And if you don't dish them soon, you're just going to kind of be sitting on running backs that might not have a whole lot of value, or they might only have like 1 year of value left.
Yep.
So what are your kind of thoughts on the establishing the core players? What do you look for in like a core player?
Yeah, so if I'm looking at a core player, it has to be a young running back if you're going to keep a running back. Like if it's a 25, 26-year-old, we're looking at, I think Dalvin Cook's 26, Nick Chubb's 26. Those guys are probably not going to be super beneficial to your team in the next 3 years. If you give them 3 years down the line, they're gone. They're done. Their value is probably decimated. So those are some players that if you are rebuilding, I would try to move them and get as much assets as you can right now. I'm really looking to get young wide receivers, like you said. They just hold so much more value later on in their career. And I mean, if you can get a 23, 24-year-old, they turn 26, 27, those are way more valuable than those running backs at that same age. And that's usually when they kind of hit their stride as well. They kind of find their quarterback, or maybe they're going into free agency and they're able to pick where they want to go and get their quarterback. So, yeah, that position is really key for me. Running back, I really like to try to get them in the draft more than anything. I'm trying to trade them away when they get about 26 years old. And once they get that second contract, it's about time for them to move off your team as well. Tight ends, I mean, it's a crapshoot for tight ends. Quarterbacks, if you have a young quarterback, you're probably set for a long time. I mean, those guys can play for 15, 16, 17 years. I mean, we see it right now. Big Ben, you got Drew Brees played for a long time. So those guys can be staples. But I'm really looking for those young wide receivers to start that core rebuild and try to just move off those old veteran players that have big names.
Again, looking at the rebuild process, when I've established my core players, whoever it is, and say you're lucky enough right now to have like a Kyle Pitts,
Mm-hmm.
that would be amazing. Because
Huge.
I don't think there's any similar talent. I mean, obviously there's not projected similar talent coming out of this class, but you never know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Next year, I think we have a good tight end coming, and then the following year we have Brock Bowers, I
Mm-hmm.
believe. So, if you can snag those guys, those are keys to a rebuild right there. Because I know you really like, and I get this too, is you want to have a good tight end because it just gives you that much more of a positional advantage.
Yep.
Um, but so after you've established the core players, it's time to kind of determine who has value outside of those core players to competitive teams. And the reason why is because typically competitive teams are going to spend the most up to get these guys on their rosters.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing is like when you're the top team, is like the last thing you're probably going to do is just sit on your roster.
Yeah.
Like, and if you're a team that just won the championship, that is the absolute worst thing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Do not get complacent. That is just not great. That's a great way to just never win again. So and then the way, you always have to trade away for proper compensation. And I'll get into this a little bit later. My target is always picks and prospects, and I know that's kind of, probably cliche,
Mm-hmm.
but after you kind of determined who has the value to the competing teams, who's just not worth rostering, be honest with yourself. Don't be the guy that just tries to trade pieces you wouldn't trade for just to get something in return.
Mm-hmm.
You have a pretty good gauge on who is just, or I'd like to think most people have a pretty good gauge on, like, does this guy have any long-term value even to next year? Guys like Rex Burkhead
Yeah.
is a guy that comes to mind. Guys like Duke Johnson, who had one blow up game, same kind of deal. But, outside of the core, it's just really important to turn those into as much as you can, get space on your roster, and then load your team up with stashes, lottery picks, high upside players, players that could see their role increase any which way you can. Because I think then you're essentially just putting a bunch of, you know, lottery picks on your team that could explode in value at any time.
Mm-hmm.
And you could either keep these guys and hold on to them, and now you have an awesome player on your roster forever, or you can flip these guys for a well appreciated value than what you got them for off the waiver wire. So that's kind of what I'm looking to do outside of my core players. That alone is such a huge part of the process because you're building the groundwork for what your team can look like going forward. Getting into the trading strategy, we kind of talked about it a little bit. My big thing, I always, when I'm in a rebuild, it's a little different if I'm in a competing team because those are different kind of trades. But
Mm-hmm.
when I'm in a rebuild, my number one rule with trading is always get more assets in return than what you're sending.
Yeah.
If you're sending 2 players, you should be getting at least 3 back. I would rather get 4 back. I'd rather get 2 for 1 on everything I send.
Yeah.
Reason being is that way you're just going to get just a nasty abundance of assets. You're going to have a load of picks, and stack your picks out for years to come, as
Yep.
far out as your league lets you trade picks. Don't necessarily focus all in the 2023 draft just because we think it's going to be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Put some into 2022, put some into 23, 24, so on. Because what's going to happen, and you'll see this over time, is you're just going to end up with, like I said, this abundance of assets that will make competitive trading for easier later. And it'll be easier to manipulate drafts where it's like if you're at the 201 and you want to kind of get to the 107, it's a lot easier to trade a 201 than your 207 to get a
Mm-hmm.
guy to move. Then it's a much smaller asset. You could throw like a 201 and a mid 2 then for that 107, and you might not get the deal done if the guy wants to get a guy there, but it's just that kind of concept of inchworming your way up the draft board. And that's just one way, but otherwise picks are a great way to kind of bridge the gap between player values.
Yeah, so when I'm trading, I'm looking at the other teams as well. Just like I said in the beginning, like you need to look at these teams. If somebody has all these old running backs and they have all these old wide receivers, and they may be a competing team because they have all these old savvy veterans, that team's probably not going to be too good in the next few years, depending on the ages of the players. So that's a team that you could manipulate and get their first round pick or second round picks and do some damage later on in the draft. I'm also looking to just get as many picks as possible, man. Because I mean, at the end of the day, you can trade those picks and get picks back at any moment. So I'm trying to get as much assets as I can. Like you said, it's not always about the players for me. If I can get a couple draft picks and be able to use those in future trades, for me, that's the biggest thing. Especially if I'm going to drop these players anyways after the draft, where I have to cut down my roster a little bit. I'm going to try to get any kind of value. Like if I have to get a fourth or fifth round pick for a guy, you're going to drop him anyways. Why not even try? Those picks can go a long way in trades. I mean, you just throw it out there. You can throw a fourth or fifth round and be like, oh, does this sweeten the deal? Does this get it done? And it
Right.
could. You just never know. And that's where I've seen to find a little bit of success with trades. If I have a lot of picks, just throw a bunch at them, and they're gonna be like, "Oh wow, he's giving me all these picks. Oh, it's such a great deal." And
Right.
at the end of the day, third, fourth round picks, you don't really know what's going to be there. Like this
Right.
2022 class, like I think it's really going to be top heavy compared to other classes that are going to have a lot more depth coming forward. So if you're giving away a third or fourth, you're looking at a lottery pick anyway. Don't sweat maybe giving those up for a player. Um, but if you can acquire as many picks, man, that is the way to go. Never just go one for one. I don't think I've ever seen a one for one trade in Dynasty that really has panned out.
But yeah, no, the one for one, I just is always tough. It's just an odd thing for me. I just don't like doing one for one trades,
Hmm.
especially at the same position. I think you made a great point with just trying to accrue picks because the one thing with picks is they will never depreciate in value. If there
Hmm.
is a small depreciation of value, it's usually right after the NFL draft because people are kind of thinking that, oh, maybe my 207 isn't as good as I thought it was going to be. Stuff like that. But
Yeah.
for the most part, you can always get better value on picks, and you never know how the draft's going to fall either. There's been several cases where I've traded this year's third for next year's second in the middle of a draft, straight up. And
Perfect.
it's because people want to get their guy now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'll take the hit on that right now and soak up a little value later. Why not?
Hmm.
And so not every league is going to be able to do that. Not every player is going to do that. But it's just one of those things where like I'm always trying to get those picks, like you said. And then the other thing, when trading, and this is goes for every aspect of trading, is don't necessarily be looking to win the trade because I think
Yep.
more often than not, that's not going to happen. Like not with my Godwin deal.
Hmm.
I'm looking pretty good on that,
Yeah.
but don't look to win the trade. Instead, look to kind of find ways where you can fill gaps on your trade partner's team
Hmm.
because that's going to be the thing that gets deals done. Is if I would highly encourage you if you're not getting a lot of trades done in your leagues, if the league's active and there are other people getting trades done, I would seriously consider like, oh, am I looking to just win the trade? Look at the other opposing team. look at, especially when you're rebuilding and you have, say a Keenan Allen on your team, and you're like, I think it's time to rebuild. I love
Mm-hmm.
Keenan Allen, but I think it's time to move him. He can still be a great valuable piece to a team that's, set to lose, like Julio Jones, or just has a ton of more declining assets that are maybe a little old. Like if a team has Julio Jones and say T.Y. Hilton, and
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of probably a little past their prime already, but you can kind of get them, back in the mix of things at wide receiver if you can throw them a Keenan Allen.
Yep.
And Keenan Allen still has a ton of value. You could probably get a first plus out of that. I don't think you're
Yeah.
getting a ton, not right now.
No.
And that is the thing too, is it's always better to try to trade these really good assets like in season,
Mm-hmm.
just because if you can get in on the arms race that happens at before trade deadlines or before the playoffs,
Yep.
you're just going to be able to get everything for such an exponentially more value. But sooner is better than later with these guys before they have no value left. You mentioned earlier guys like Nick Chubb and Dalvin Cook, who this was not a good year for their value. Like
Mm-hmm.
between injuries and just being back and forth, they still both had really good games, but this was just not a good year for their value.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing when, trading strategy, when I'm in a rebuild, is I always want to target if I'm targeting prospects, I want to target players who are more than likely going to appreciate in value in some way.
Yes.
Because I don't necessarily want to add a guy who's, like I traded my fourth for like a fifth in Tyler Johnson.
Mm.
And I'm like, I think that's a good deal because more than likely Tyler Johnson's going to go up. Although we did just have that game where he had 0 targets and he was the quote unquote wide receiver 1 in that game. But it's stuff like that where, target guys that can appreciate value. For example, maybe rookies that disappointed in year 1 that you
Mm-hmm.
still believe in. Terrace Marshall will be probably a buy low guy for a lot of people. And I don't personally see it just because of how he was treated on that team, being a healthy scratch, stuff like that. That's usually a pretty good indicator that he's just not, in Matt Rule's eyes or that coaching staff's eyes, he's just not cut out for this league. But rookies that disappointed or maybe just fell low of expectations. We touched on this a little bit already, but just kind of positions to build around.
Mm-hmm.
Starting at wide receiver / quarterback, just because they have the longest lifespan.
Yep.
And then when you're ready to compete, work up to drafting running backs and tight ends, because that's probably where you're going to find the best tight ends.
Yeah.
Good ones don't find their way to the wire unless there's other teams that are kind of in their rebuilding phase. And then that's kind of where you hopefully have this abundance of picks and assets where you can trade for those really good tight ends that are, maybe on the tail end of their career, especially with the tight ends that we know are coming out. Like I said, not great ones this year, but in 2023 and 2024, I believe we have at least one really good tight end in both of those classes. So,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of where I'm at. Drafting running backs, you touched on it. That's where you're going to find running backs the cheapest is.
Oh yeah.
And the thing is too that you can still draft running backs and rebuild IMO
Mm-hmm.
because you could be looking at a faster rebuild than you think.
Yep.
I always boast about this, but I rebuilt the team in one season
Yeah.
and won the championship that
Yep.
same year.
It's a
And
good thing. The listeners are listening to 2 people that did that. I just did that in the Dynasty Rewind League as well. I got
okay.
last place, and then now I just got first place. So
Yeah.
it's possible.
Yeah, I know. If you do it right, I think it can be a lot quicker than you think.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chance that it's not going to happen as quickly. I will say that I got lucky with some of the trades I got because I got, this was when Tyler Lockett was one of my key additions that year. And I got him for like nothing. And it was just one of those deals where I'm like, okay, like I'll take, I think, like I said, I think he was banged up. And so I just got him at a super discount. And it was just one of those things where going into that year, I had traded Todd Gurley like the year before he absolutely fell off the wagon. I got 3 first-round picks for that guy. So, and all of those, I just spent the last one last year on, I want to say I got Swift last year and I got, I think, ETN this year, which isn't as exciting.
Such a blessing, though. Oh my gosh.
Right. I know. It's just like like I said, you want to get out on these guys when there's still value to be had. Moves like that can really just, I mean, jumpstart your rebuild, and it is possible to do it in 1 year, with a little luck. All in all, you have to be patient. Like I said, not all of these are going to flip in 1 year. You have to make good draft picks. Do your research. Keep it plugged in here at the Dynasty Rewind. We will help you navigate the draft class the best we can. Stay on top of waivers, because you can get guys like Sony Michel that people left cut because they thought he wasn't going to do anything. People like who's another running back? People like
Shot Penny. I mean,
Rashad Penny. I got him for free in a league this year, and I'm like, I don't know if he's going to be the guy next year, but it's like, stay on top of your waivers, because you never know what's going to be out there. Because I think in the dynasty community, I think there are a lot of leagues that are really deep, that are like 40-man rosters in a 12 plus team league. But I think, I play with some shallower rosters as well, and you never know what's out there. So just keep an eye out on the waivers, on Sleeper, keep an eye on who's trending up, and maybe there's, right now it's a weird trending up cycle, because there's people picking up the most random players to start in week 18 because people are still playing in week 18 for some reason. But, just stay on top of it, because you never know what's going to be out there. You might have guys that are going to not only necessarily help long-term, like a Rashad Penny, but like a Rex Burkhead, like a Sony Michel, players that can kind of maybe even help you to a championship in that respect.
Yeah, hitting the waiver wire is huge. Sometimes you just need to grab those young players that could possibly break out. I mean, I grabbed Ramondre Stevenson, and that was the game right before he busted out. And once he busted out, man, everybody was like, "Oh, Ramondre Stevenson, he's gonna be so good." I traded him away. I mean, I'm sure he's gonna have value later on, but recency bias is a big thing to play on, in my opinion. Once a guy has a big game or gets a lot of attention for whatever reason, that's sometimes a good time to trade. And it could be the last time or it could not be. But I love being able to move players like that. Just from the waiver wire alone, you could find some diamonds in the rough and you can get really lucky sometimes. So be playing the waiver wire really, really hard during your seasons, and trying to play off that recency bias as well, because that's really helped me rebuild those teams a little bit quicker as well.
Absolutely. No, I that's an awesome point that I completely forgot about, is the quick flip.
Yeah.
If and that's what can really pay off with grabbing all these stashes, is you never know that, they could have a big game in the preseason and never be heard from again.
Yep.
Guys like Jonas Gray. You remember Jonas Gray? I know it wasn't a preseason game, but like that dude was like the dude for like a week and a half. Then he's like, he never ever heard from again. It's crazy how, and that's where, moving picks quickly, that is a situation where I'd probably do a 1-for-1 deal. Is if I don't necessarily see the player's upside, but I'm like, I can get a second round pick. All right, whatever. I would like to get two, like a 2 and a 3, but that's just because I'm a little greedy when it comes to that. And don't panic, trust the process, just chill out, and have fun with it. Because this is the way I've always looked at rebuilds and orphan teams when I pick them up. Because most orphans you get are not good teams. It is, like this is your baby now. Like, take care of it, and the more you put into it, the better the team usually ends up being. Eventually, all told, you'll end up with this abundance of assets between picks and prospects and stud players you drafted. In my opinion, you'll be built for the long haul and be stronger than any dynasty team, and you'll be deeper. It's just one of those things, don't be afraid to start. If you feel like you're in the middle and you don't feel like you're an ascending team yet, this is something you can kind of try to put into practice. But I think, like I said, you take these steps, you do what you can, you stay on it, trust the process, and you'll be in for the long haul in a very good dynasty venture. Leave comments down below. We want to know either, rebuilding strategies that you've had that have worked for you. Have you ever done anything like this? Are you in a rebuild mode right now? It is the off season, so now is a great time to evaluate your rosters and kind of see where you're at. But please let us know down in the comments below. Like I said, leave a like if you enjoyed this video. I do hope it was very helpful. And we at the Dynasty Rewind just want to help you win more leagues, enjoy fantasy football more, and just have a great time doing that. So from me and Chev, we're going to be out of here, but I do hope y'all have a good one.